When an interview turns into a battlefield, celebrity interviews are supposed to be polished. Smiles, rehearsed anecdotes, maybe a little controversy to spice things up, but rarely chaos. Yet sometimes the script unravels. Sometimes the mask slips, and instead of harmless promotion, the audience gets a front row seat to an implosion. One of the most infamous examples came in 2005, when Tom Cruise sat down with Matt Lauer on NBC's Today Show. What was meant to be a straightforward promotional interview for War of the Worlds spiraled into one of the most awkward and confrontational exchanges in live television history. It was the moment Cruise's carefully managed image cracked in front of millions, and the fallout lasted for years. The context: a star at his peak. In the early 2000s, Tom Cruise was untouchable. He was one of Hollywood's most bankable stars, with blockbusters like Top Gun, Mission Impossible, and Jerry Maguire cementing his status as a box office powerhouse. He was charming, articulate, and deeply respected for his dedication to his craft. But behind the scenes, Cruise's increasing involvement with the Church of Scientology was beginning to spill into public view. The actor had become outspoken about his beliefs, particularly regarding psychiatry and the use of prescription drugs. He insisted that psychology was a pseudoscience and that medication for mental health was dangerous. These views were controversial, but until 2005, Cruise had managed to keep most of his interviews focused on film rather than faith. Then came Matt Lauer. The interview begins. On June 24, 2005, Cruise appeared on the Today Show to promote Steven Spielberg's War of the Worlds. At first, the conversation was typical Hollywood fluff. Questions about the movie, Cruise's family, his upcoming projects. He laughed, he smiled, and for a moment, it looked like just another interview. But then, Matt Lauer brought up Cruise's recent criticism of actress Brooke Shields. Shields had spoken openly about her struggle with postpartum depression and credited antidepressants with helping her recover. Cruise had publicly attacked her for it, calling her use of medication irresponsible. It was a comment that sparked outrage, especially among women and mental health advocates. Lauer decided to confront him directly. "You don't know the history of psychiatry." What followed was less an interview than a sparring match. Lauer pressed Cruise on his comments about Brooke Shields, suggesting that her choice to take medication was personal and valid. Cruise, visibly agitated, leaned forward and launched into a passionate tirade. "You don't know the history of psychiatry," he snapped. "I do." What started as a disagreement quickly escalated into a lecture. Cruise dismissed antidepressants as dangerous, accused the psychiatric profession of corruption, and insisted that vitamins and exercise were the real solution to mental health issues. Lauer tried to interject, noting that for some people, medication could be life-saving. But Cruise cut him off repeatedly, raising his voice and pointing his finger. The tension was palpable. Viewers at home could feel the hostility radiating through the screen. What should have been a conversation about a summer blockbuster had turned into a full-blown debate on medicine, science, and personal freedom. The iconic line, "You're glib." The interview hit its breaking point when Lauer tried to assert his opinion. He calmly suggested that while he wasn't an expert, he believed antidepressants could help some people. Cruise's response became instantly infamous. "Matt, you're glib. You don't even know what Ritalin is. You don't know what Prozac is." The word glib echoed across media outlets for weeks. It wasn't just the insult, it was the arrogance behind it. The way Cruise dismissed Lauer's questions as ignorant while presenting himself as the sole authority. By the end of the segment, Cruise looked less like Hollywood's golden boy and more like an angry preacher. The damage was done. The fallout. The interview was a public relations disaster. Overnight, Cruise went from being one of America's most beloved actors to one of its most controversial. Headlines mocked him. Late-night comedians had a field day. Clips of the interview went viral before viral was even a thing. Mental health professionals condemned his comments, accusing him of spreading dangerous misinformation. Brooke Shields herself hit back, writing up ads defending her right to medical treatment and slamming Cruise for stigmatizing mothers struggling with depression. Even Hollywood insiders began to whisper. Cruise's partnership with Paramount Pictures grew strained. Steven Spielberg, who had directed him in War of the Worlds, reportedly distanced himself. Industry analysts suggested that Cruise's public meltdown contributed to his sudden decline in box office dominance in the years that followed. For Matt Lauer, the fallout was different. At the time, the exchange boosted his reputation as a tough interviewer. Viewers praised him for holding his ground against a superstar. But looking back, knowing Lauer's later downfall due to his own misconduct, the irony is heavy. Why it was a disaster. So why does this interview stand out among celebrity disasters? Because it broke the unspoken rules of publicity. Interviews are meant to showcase a star's charisma, not their dogma. Audiences tune in to see charm, wit, relatability. Instead, they saw Cruise aggressively lecturing a journalist, dismissing scientific consensus, and condescending to millions of viewers who relied on antidepressants for survival. In that moment, Cruise shattered the carefully cultivated image that his PR team had built over decades. He wasn't the smiling action hero anymore. He was a man consumed by his beliefs, unwilling to listen, unwilling to yield. It was less about Scientology itself and more about the arrogance of certainty. To many viewers, it felt like he was telling them their struggles weren't real, their solutions weren't valid, their experiences weren't legitimate. That kind of dismissal cuts deep, and audiences never forgot it. The long shadow, the glib, interview didn't exist in a vacuum. Just weeks earlier, Cruise had already raised eyebrows with another disastrous moment, his infamous couch-jumping appearance on Oprah, where he declared his love for Katie Holmes. Together, the Oprah couch and the Lauer clash cemented a new perception of Cruise, not as Hollywood's leading man, but as a volatile, unpredictable figure. It took years for Cruise to rebuild his reputation. He eventually did, largely through a return to blockbuster action films like Mission Impossible and a deliberate strategy of staying quiet about his personal beliefs. But the 2005 Matt Lauer interview remains a turning point, a moment when the world saw behind the curtain, the night America saw pain instead of glamour. Whitney Houston was supposed to be untouchable. Her voice defined a generation, her records shattered sales charts, and her performances were once described as angelic. But by the early 2000s, the cracks were showing. Years of rumors about drug use, erratic behavior, and a turbulent marriage to Bobby Brown had tarnished the image of the woman once hailed as the voice. In 2002, Houston agreed to a sit-down with veteran journalist Diane Sawyer on ABC's Primetime. It was billed as a chance to clear the air, a candid interview where Houston could silence the rumors and reclaim her reputation and remind America of her brilliance. Instead, it became one of the most infamous celebrity interviews of all time. What was supposed to be redemption turned into disaster, setting the stage. The early 2000s were a rough chapter for Whitney Houston. Tabloids were relentless. Photos of her looking gaunt and fragile circulated widely. Reports of missed concerts, strange behavior, and declining vocal ability raised alarm. Allegations of cocaine addiction were everywhere. Her team likely hoped the Sawyer interview would be a turning point. Diane Sawyer was tough but respected, known for her ability to balance empathy with hard questions. A successful interview could have reminded viewers that Whitney was still strong, still brilliant, and still worthy of admiration. But from the very beginning, it was clear this would not be a carefully managed redemption arc. Sawyer asks the hard questions. Diane Sawyer didn't waste time. She asked about drugs directly, about the rumors, about the tabloid headlines. This was not a softball promotional interview. It was a confrontation. At one point, Sawyer bluntly asked if Houston was using crack cocaine, echoing tabloid reports. Whitney, clearly irritated, fired back with the now iconic line, "First of all, let's get one thing straight. Crack is cheap. I make too much money to ever smoke crack." Okay, let's get that straight. We don't do crack. Don't do that. Crack is whack. The phrase, "crack is whack," instantly became a cultural catchphrase. But it wasn't funny. It was sad. The way Houston delivered it, defensive, jittery, her eyes darting, her voice sharp, did not inspire confidence. Instead of putting rumors to rest, the clip became evidence in the public's mind that something was very, very wrong. "Show me the receipts." The interview spiraled further when Sawyer pressed Houston on reports of her deteriorating health. Tabloids had claimed she weighed as little as 90 pounds, painting her as dangerously frail. Whitney's response was both defiant and tragic. "I want to see the receipts. Show me the receipts. Did they weigh me? Did they measure me?" It was a soundbite that lived on for years. Instead of clearing her name, it made her look combative and evasive. People didn't remember the nuance of her words. They remembered the anger, the defensiveness, and the haunting image of a superstar under siege. Body language tells the story. Perhaps the most devastating part of the interview wasn't what Houston said, but how she said it. Her body language betrayed her. She looked restless, her movements sharp, her voice rising and falling unpredictably. There were flashes of the old Whitney, the charisma, the humor, the regal confidence, but they were buried under layers of tension. For fans, it was painful to watch. This wasn't the radiant star who had once belted "I will always love you" with effortless grace. This was a woman clearly struggling, yet trying to project strength. The disconnect was heartbreaking. The aftermath, The interview aired on ABC in December 2002, and the reaction was immediate. Headlines didn't focus on her attempts to defend herself. They focused on the sound bites. "Crack is whack. Show me the receipts." Late-night hosts joked about it. Tabloids ran mocking covers. The internet, still in its early viral era, spread clips relentlessly. Instead of restoring her reputation, the interview cemented the public perception that Whitney Houston was spiraling. Industry insiders later admitted that agreeing to such a candid interview was a mistake. It was too raw, too unfiltered, too revealing. Instead of controlling the narrative, Whitney and her team had handed it to the press on a silver platter. Why it was a disaster? What makes this interview stand out as a disaster isn't just the awkwardness. It's the tragedy behind it. Whitney Houston wasn't an arrogant star lecturing an interviewer like Tom Cruise. She was a wounded legend caught in a moment where her struggles were too big to hide, but too painful to admit. The interview became a mirror of her decline. For Sawyer, it was a journalistic win. For Whitney, it was devastating. Every attempt to push back only made her seem more vulnerable. Instead of silencing rumors, she amplified them. Instead of looking strong, she looked fragile. The disaster wasn't just in the words spoken. It was in the cultural impact. The interview became shorthand for Whitney's downfall, overshadowing her music, her artistry, and her humanity. The long shadow. In the years that followed, Whitney Houston continued to battle addiction and public scrutiny. She attempted comebacks, but the narrative had shifted. The Sawyer interview lived on in public memory, replayed endlessly whenever her name resurfaced in tabloids. Tragically, Whitney Houston passed away in 2012 at just 48 years old. In the retrospectives that followed, the Sawyer interview was often revisited, not as a moment of empowerment, but as a haunting symbol of her struggles. It remains one of the most cited examples of a celebrity interview gone wrong, because it captured, in real time, the unraveling of an icon. The King of Pop opens the gates. Michael Jackson was one of the most famous, mysterious, and scrutinized figures in the history of entertainment. For decades, the world had obsessed over his music, his appearance, and his private life. By the early 2000s, Jackson was desperate to reclaim control of his public image. He wanted to show the world that he was not the eccentric recluse painted by tabloids, but a loving father, a misunderstood artist, and a man still capable of inspiring wonder. So when British journalist Martin Bashir approached him with the idea of a documentary, Jackson saw opportunity. He agreed to give Bashir unprecedented access to his lifetime inside Neverland Ranch, time with his children, even glimpses into his most intimate routines. The project, titled Living with Michael Jackson, aired in 2003 to global audiences. Jackson thought it would be redemption. Instead, it became one of the most catastrophic media disasters of his career. Bashir's approach. From the beginning, Martin Bashir presented himself as sympathetic. He positioned the documentary as a humanizing portrait, suggesting he wanted to show Michael as a devoted father and artist. For Jackson, who had spent years hiding from tabloids and lawsuits, this must have seemed like a lifeline. But once cameras rolled, Bashir's approach shifted. Instead of a glowing profile, the documentary framed Jackson as erratic, unstable, and troublingly out of touch with reality. The tone was set early with shots of Neverland Ranch, edited to emphasize its childlike atmosphere. Rides, animals, candy stores. Instead of focusing on the joy Jackson believed he was creating, Bashir suggested it was a disturbing retreat into arrested development. And then came the bombshell moment, the sharing the bed. Controversy. In one scene, Jackson is seen sitting next to a young boy, Gavin Arvizo, who would later become a central figure in the child molestation allegations against him. When asked about sleeping arrangements, Jackson casually admitted that children sometimes slept in his bed. He insisted it was innocent. "It's a beautiful thing," Jackson said. "When you sleep with someone you love, it's a pure, innocent thing." He claimed he would often sleep on the floor while children took the bed. To him, it was an act of kindness and comfort. But to the world, the soundbite was devastating. The images of Jackson holding hands with the boy, paired with his words about sharing a bed, became headline material overnight. What Jackson thought was a demonstration of his innocence and generosity was interpreted as proof of something darker, a narrative out of his control. The rest of the documentary doubled down on this framing. Bashir questioned Jackson about his plastic surgeries, his skin condition, and his eccentric lifestyle. Instead of showcasing a genius at work, the program painted a portrait of a man detached from reality, incapable of understanding how disturbing his choices looked to outsiders. One of the most damaging sequences showed Jackson shopping in a luxury store, casually spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on antiques and trinkets. It fed into the public perception of him as financially irresponsible and out of touch with ordinary life. Most importantly, the documentary gave prosecutors and critics ammunition. The bed sharing comments would haunt Jackson for the rest of his life, fueling lawsuits, criminal charges, and endless media ridicule. The fallout when Living with Michael Jackson aired. It was watched by nearly 30 million people in the UK and tens of millions more worldwide. The public reaction was swift and brutal. Newspapers screamed with headlines about Jackson's confessions. TV pundits tore apart his credibility. Late-night comedians mocked him mercilessly. Far from restoring his reputation, the documentary shredded it further. Instead of showing Jackson as a misunderstood father, it reinforced every suspicion about him. And the damage didn't end with public opinion. Authorities in California reopened investigations into his behavior with children. Just months later, Gavin Arvizo, the same boy featured in the documentary, accused Jackson of molestation. That accusation led to the infamous 2005 trial, which dominated headlines and nearly destroyed Jackson's career. He was ultimately acquitted, but his image never fully recovered. Michael's response: "They betrayed me." Jackson was furious with Bashir after the documentary aired. He claimed he had been manipulated, betrayed, and edited to look guilty. In response, his team released a counter documentary using behind-the-scenes footage. This version showed moments when Bashir had been more complimentary, praising Jackson as a father and marveling at the joy of Neverland. These clips had been cut from the final broadcast, fueling Jackson's claim that the documentary was biased. But by then, the damage was irreversible. The world had already seen the broadcast. The bed sharing, quote, had already entered the cultural lexicon. No amount of counter footage could erase the stain. Why it was a disaster. What makes the Bashir interview documentary one of the greatest celebrity interview disasters isn't just the fallout. It's the sheer scale of self-sabotage. Jackson had sought out the cameras, hoping to control his narrative. Instead, he handed his most vulnerable image to a journalist whose goal was to provoke controversy. He underestimated how his words would be perceived outside the bubble of Neverland. To him, kindness and innocence were the themes. To the world, it was evidence of strangeness, recklessness, and danger. Unlike Tom Cruise's Meltdown or Whitney Houston's defensiveness, Jackson's disaster wasn't a single slip. It was a 2-hour unraveling that reinforced every criticism against him. The Long Shadow. The Bashir documentary became a turning point in Michael Jackson's life. It ignited the 2005 trial, which consumed his career and forced him into years of retreat. Though he was acquitted, the stigma remained. Every retrospective about Jackson now includes clips from Living with Michael Jackson. The image of him holding hands with a child, calmly explaining bed sharing, is replayed endlessly. It has outlived his defenses, his counter footage, and even his death. For fans, the documentary is painful not because it exposed guilt. He was never convicted, but because it showed a genius unable to see how badly he was being manipulated. It revealed a man desperate for love and understanding, but disastrously incapable of managing his own image. When the cameras turn too bright, what do these interviews tell us? They tell us that fame is fragile, that behind the lights, the makeup, and the rehearsed smiles, celebrities are human beings under immense pressure. And when that pressure collides with live cameras, the result can be explosive. Tom Cruise thought he was defending his beliefs, but instead, he came off arrogant and dismissive. Whitney Houston wanted to silence rumors, but her defiance only amplified them. Michael Jackson opened his world to prove his innocence, but he ended up fueling suspicions that followed him to his grave. Each of these moments has something in common: the loss of control. That's the disaster at the heart of every one of these interviews. Celebrities carefully manage their images through PR teams, stylists, and handlers, but an interview, raw, unpredictable, unedited, can shatter that illusion in seconds. And once the illusion is gone, it can never be rebuilt the same way again. The cost of vulnerability. For some stars, the fallout was temporary. Tom Cruise eventually reclaimed his throne as Hollywood's action hero by shifting focus back to blockbusters and staying quiet about personal beliefs. But for others, like Whitney Houston and Michael Jackson, the damage lingered. The interviews became shorthand for their struggles, replayed endlessly in retrospectives, overshadowing their artistry. It's tragic, really. The world remembers the sound bites. Your glib, crack, is whack. It's a beautiful thing to share your bed. Those sound bites reduce complex, flawed, extraordinary people into caricatures of their worst public moments. These interviews weren't just disasters for the celebrities. They were cultural events that shaped how we think about fame, addiction, belief, and downfall. They forced conversations about mental health, about privacy, about how much of a person's truth the public is entitled to demand. The lesson for us. So why do these disastrous interviews matter? Because they remind us of something deeper. Celebrities may live on pedestals, but the higher the pedestal, the harder the fall. Every disastrous interview is a collision between public expectation and private reality. We expect charm, control, and flawless narratives. But what we often get instead is fear, arrogance, pain, or desperation. And when those truths are exposed on live television, the world never forgets. For us, as viewers, they're entertainment. For the stars, they're turning points. Some recover, some never do. But all of them prove the same point. Fame doesn't protect you when the camera turns too bright. And that's the real story of celebrity interviews that ended in disaster. Not just awkward TV, not just viral clips, but the rawest moments when the mask of fame slipped and the world saw the human being beneath. Because in the end, an interview is more than questions and answers. It is a mirror, and sometimes that mirror reflects a truth that no celebrity and no audience is ever ready to face.